All right, SP Leaf has just been released on JP today. I previously had very high expectations for him, but after reading his kit, I feel like I'm a bit disappointed, to be honest. So I'll go through all of his kit with you guys and tell you how I reached that conclusion. Now, there's one very, very strong point about Leaf, which is actually going to be his deployment bomb with SP Kenma. So I'll be sure to mention that as well. So even though I may sound very negative about Leaf for majority of the video, once you get towards the end, when I actually talk about deployment bond, you will don't realize how crazy that individual bond is. Okay, but the character itself, I feel like he's a bit underwhelming. But anyway, let's just go through all of his skills one by one. I do have his skill resonance, etc., and memory as well. Okay, so skill one, when Leaf is on the court, when you do a perfect action, you will be buffing up his quick and also block stat up to maximum 7 times. So that's basically maximum 21%, which is decent. Also, when he's actually on the court and someone on your side actually scores, they will get buff called scoring ace, increasing their basic stat by 500. Now, if you actually want to put that 500 into perspective, I think for vast majority of characters, especially at high resonance, if you actually build with all of the right potentials, etc., you can probably get to around 4,000 to 5,000 in the stats they're the best at. So this 500, put that into perspective, is probably just over 10%. Now, this is on global. On JP, once you have coaches, etc., I have seen some people with obviously the massive pay to win wells, but they would have their basic stats probably around 6,000 or 7,000, etc. So this for them on JP players is probably more equivalent to only like a 7 or 8%. Okay, so this is decent, but it's definitely not very high. Then the other thing you also have to be careful of, although there could be, I mean, I probably need someone to actually test this, but at least judging by the way I've read the translation, is that this will be gained, this buff, scoring ace buff, is gained by whoever actually perform or score that point, which basically means if you do a surface or do a block kill, then this buff will also be added towards them as well, okay? So there's actually going to be a bit of RNG involved here in terms of who will actually be the ones actually getting that scoring ace. And that's actually going to be quite important once you take a look at some of his later skill. Now, skill 2, this is another interesting one. So basically, he has a block skill equal to 150%. Now, when they're back row teammates with receive skill, you increase refresh by 50%. Now, this are kind of considered to be permanently on, because normally you either have liberals at the back, or if you choose to not play liberal, that normally means there's someone else good at receiving in the back, okay? So that's kind of why this is almost going to be permanently on. Now, what makes this actually skill interesting is that when there are other front row teammate with block skill, then the power of this block will increase by additional 150%. So this basically combined together to a 300% multiplier. And that basically means even though this blocking skill is not ultimate, it does have a 300% multiplier, which is actually on par with a lot of ultimate skill. Now, the reason why I say this skill is actually very, very interesting is that the condition for this is that there will be other front row teammate with block skill. And then if you actually take a look at the way you potentially might actually build Leaf, I'm going to be honest, you probably would build him with quick spiking rather than with any kind of block stat. So even though he do have a 300% multiplier, it's on a character with no block potential, without any block build. And if the condition for this is that there's already another front row teammate with a block skill, and I'm going to assume that teammate probably is actually properly built with all of the block potential, block memories, etc., then there's actually a high chance, even though you have a 300% multiplier here, it's actually going to not be as strong as their basic block without any multiplier, well, with just the default 100% multiplier. So the mere fact that you actually need to get another front row teammate with a blocking skill in order to trigger this ability kind of already diminish the value of the skill full stop, because you will probably just end up using your other front row teammate who actually have that block skill, right? So this, I feel like, need to be tested in terms of the actual numbers, but I do have a strong feeling, for example, let's say SP Hiragami's normal block would be more valuable than a 300% multiplier build up 300% multiplier skill from Leaf without any blocking potential at all. Okay, so that's something we will actually need to see the numbers to decide. But just yeah, I certainly wouldn't think too highly of this 300% just because it says that on paper. In practice, you may not actually end up even using this skill at all. Then skill 3, at the start of the match, Leaf will be the one getting that scoring ace buff. And then what's going to happen is that when you have gained that buff, the power of the next 2 touches will be increased by 40% of the corresponding stat. Leaf will also increase that stat by equivalent to 50%. Now, first of all, judging by the wording, I feel like Leaf would be always getting this, even if he himself have the scoring ace bar. He will just increase it by an additional 50%. And then this is also capped to maximum 2000 for the basic stat, maximum 100 for awareness, reflex, strength, spirit, and maximum 20% for attack and defense stat. Now, there's two things with this skill tree, okay? So the first half is going to be the effect on the player with the scoring ace buff, and then the second half is going to be on actually just Leaf himself. Now, in terms of the buff on the player with scoring ace buff, once again, I feel like this is going to be overrated because if you actually think about the condition of how you even obtain this buff, you actually need to score a point previously, okay? And that normally means, for example, if you actually score the point with the spiking skill, then your spiking ultimate is now actually going to go into cooldown, and you wouldn't even be using him for the next, I don't know, 8 net crossings. And whether or not you will even be using him and you want to get that additional 40% buff, it's going to be a massive question mark. So I do feel like this, while sounds very, very strong on paper, it's going to be a lot more determined by who actually get the scoring ace buff. If there's a spiker and they actually have like a normal spiking ultimate cooldown, then this wouldn't be too beneficial. However, let's say if you actually have it on someone with a shortened cooldown, for example, SP Hoshiyumi, or let's say SP Yushijima, or even if the scoring ace buff is, let's say it's actually obtained by a server. So, for example, they get a serve ace, then immediately they will be serving again, or maybe by a blocker, and because he's the only blocker up front, so therefore he will still be the one blocking next, even though he already used up his ultimate skill. In those kind of scenarios, I can see the value of this. However, in terms from spiking point of view, I do feel once again the value of this won't really be utilized because your spiking ultimate will be in cooldown, and therefore you wouldn't even be doing any touches at all. And by the time your spike actually comes on cooldown, very likely you would have already won another point, and the scoring ace buff would have already been transferred to someone else. Okay, so there's a huge uncertainty whether or not this will actually get triggered. Now, then in terms of the buff to Leaf himself, this once again is a very strong buff, judging by the numbers. This is even higher than what SP or Kawa is able to do as Skill Rhythm 4, which is crazy. So, crazy high numbers. But the problem with this, once again, is that whoever has the scoring ace buff, there's a huge uncertainty there. If it's actually end up, for example, being used by a server who normally, let's say, a setter or actually a blocker, then the main stats buff that you're actually going to be able to provide to Leaf are going to be either for surfing or for the more defensive one, in which case Leaf wouldn't actually appreciate them fully because Leaf is more wanting to do like let's say a quick spiking build, etc. Right? Or even from spiking point of view, let's say this scoring ace buff actually end up going to a power spiker who have very low quick spiking stat, and the quick spiking part wouldn't really mean much to Leaf either. Okay, maybe you will still benefit from the awareness, reflex, strength, spirit, attack, and also defense technique, but the main stat probably wouldn't be as valuable. So this kind of just makes Leaf have a very, very high cap in terms of or high ceiling in terms of that if this actually the ace scoring ace buff actually land up on someone who have very similar build to Leaf, the Leaf is going to benefit massively from them. However, at the same time, the scoring ace buff happen to end up on someone who doesn't really build in the same way as Leaf, then the value of this skill tree is going to diminish quite a bit as well. Okay, so personally, I feel like this catch can fluctuate quite a bit depending on how your match actually play out. Then let's move on to skill 4. This is ultimate skill, and it's a quick spike, 260% multiply, obviously get higher at higher levels. And then for this one, when your last set was perfect, then this will increase by additional 40%. And also when you receive and set were both perfect, then this can increase by an additional 60% and also become unblockable. Once again, another skill that looks very, very strong on paper, until you then start thinking about it in details. Okay, so normally vast majority of the time, unless you have spikers who can actually reduce cooldown, normally spiking ultimate tend to have a cooldown of 8 net crossings, and that basically means in order to make sure you always end up using ultimate spike every single time, you tend to play at least 3 spikers on the team, and that normally comes go into a very tight rotation already, where at any single point in time you tend to only have one character capable of using a spiking ultimate because the other 2 characters will be in cooldown. And that basically means is that you don't have the luxury of choosing when to use Leaf to spike. Normally you use Leaf to spike when all of your other spikers are not able to use their ultimate attack, and Leaf is the only one using ultimate attack. Okay, and that basically means in order for you to actually always get this effect to make it unblockable, you require quite a bit of RNG, because first of all, it just has to happen that both your set and receive were perfect, and then second of all, it has to happen that just so that Leaf happens to be the one that needs to spike because everyone else is already in cooldown. Okay, so there's once again a huge amount of RNG dependency here in order whether or not you can actually trigger this and make this unblockable, which in my opinion is a really bad thing, because for a lot of the quick spikers in this game, they always have a way where they can actually control when they actually do unblockable spike. Normally it's to do with like crit conditions. For example, it becomes unblockable when it's a crit or something like that. However, for Leaf, it's a lot harder for you to control because, like I said, you can't really control whether or not your receive and set always will end up being perfect. The only time you can actually control this is if you actually play SP Kenma, the second version of SP Kenma, and also play with his memory. But even in that kind of scenario, that only happens if it happens to be the first receive and set in that rally, which once again may not always be the case. So that's kind of why once again this skill is something that looks very strong on paper, right? Or unblockable, additional 100% increase in quick spike stats, etc. But then if I just think about it practically, yeah, probably wouldn't actually trigger that often, where you actually require all of the RNG to line it up perfectly for you to actually trigger this. Okay, so that's basically all his skills. Now let's move on to his dupe, so skill resistance. So at skill resistance 2, the person with scoring ace buff will increase basic stat by 15%, and if that's Leaf, he gets additional 15%. This is actually really nice. It's just a flat increase, there's no condition around that. 30% for example on Leaf, that's a massive buff. Even the basic 15% is already very strong. Okay, so this is definitely very nice. And then at the end of each rally, the one with scoring ace buff will recover 5 stamina. This can also be very nice because a lot of times you would actually play SP Kenma alongside with the SP Leaf, and the SP Kenma just make all of the rallies ridiculously long, okay? And for those kind of long rallies, you want a way to regenerate stamina. So overall, I would think skill resistance 2 is actually quite strong. Skill resistance 4, basically for each perfect action on your side in that rally so far, then the players would score your ace buff, will increase the power of the action by 10% and can stack all the way up to 300, which is massive. And then also for each point you scored, increase the strength and spirit by 5%, maximum 50%. The only thing with skill resistance 4 that I'm really caution is that even the numbers look really high, it's massively overstated, okay? Because for example, in order for you to get the maximum 300, that requires 30 perfect actions from your side. 30 perfect actions. Normally, every single time when the ball gets onto your side, you have block, receive, set, spike. That's only 4 actions. Assuming every single one of them is perfect, the ball needs to come over to your side 8 times, at least 7 times, 7 or 8 times. How ridiculous long is that rally? Okay, this I just don't see it ever really happening and can stack all the way up to 300. I would say much more realistic figure that you'll see. It's probably more going to be around the range of, I don't know, 30 to 80%. I feel like that's probably a more realistic range. This 300 is overstated by too much. Okay, and the next thing is that for each point your side scores, you're also going to increase your strength and spirit, maximum 50%. But the thing is, all of the matches right now, they're best to 5. So basically, if you actually score 5 points, you already won the match. So the max you can actually do this is just 4 stacks, so that's only 20%. So for whatever reason, they just decided to overstate the numbers on skill resistance 4 massively. So definitely do not take this at face value. In practice, the numbers wouldn't even be anywhere as high as those numbers, okay? So that's just something to be careful of. The deployment bomb with SP Kenma, this is basically an insane deployment bomb, probably by far the strongest deployment bomb I've seen. First of all, you get flat 20% awareness and reflect. This is already crazy strong by itself. You have the likes of, for example, the first version of SP Kenma. I actually need to stack up his buff like 15 times just to get 20% reflex. This is just no conditional 20% awareness and reflex straight away. So this, the first half, is already incredibly strong. And then when you start performing a perfect receive, all of your teams receive, all of your receive will increase by 30% of receive stat, and the spike power will increase by 10% as well, maximum 5 stat. Now this is insane. I have to say this is really insane, because first of all, the condition for you to even have this bond activated is that you have SP Kenma version 2, and SP Kenma version 2 actually has this gimmick where he can force a perfect receive every single rally. So basically, in maximum 3 rallies, you will already be able to stack this up maximum. And when this is fully stacked, you're going to get 150% increase in receive and 50% increase in power. That's insane. Like this is by far the highest number I've seen for any deployment bond. And even if you actually talk about like a character kit itself, 150% increase in receive is absolutely insane. Okay, so this is just crazy. I have to say, this is by far the most insane deployment bond I've ever seen, and so easy to stack up as well, right? Like I said, if you have SP Kenma, which you need in order to actually activate this, you can get this in just 2 or 3 rallies. So easy to trigger and such a strong multiplier. So absolutely insane. Then the last part is also very interesting, which is basically saying that all teammates with quick spiking skill will also get a receive skill, and that receive skill will basically be equal to 200% of the receive stat. Now it doesn't say what's going to be the cooldown for this, so I don't actually know whether or not everyone can basically spam it. My assumption is not, but nonetheless, this is already very insane as well. Okay, for 2 reasons. First of all, remember one of SP Kenma's kit. If you guys don't know his kit, then you can find it on my channel as well. But basically, for SP Kenma, one of the things he requires in order to build up his buff is that the touch need to be performed by a character with the receiving skill, and this already immediately solves it for all of the quick spiking characters, because now you all of a sudden have a lot more characters on your team who are having a receiving skill and therefore can trigger your SP Kenma's buff a lot more often. So that's one thing. The second thing is that or a lot of the quick spiking characters in this game don't actually end up having a receiving skill. Okay, so for example, if I take a look at in fact, I think all of them other than SP Hinata, and maybe Hoshiyumi. Although Hoshiyumi doesn't have a quick spiking skill either. Okay, so basically, other than SP Hinata, then no one else actually have a receiving skill. So if you actually play a quick spiking team, what could end up happening is that you are just typically actually weak at receiving, and then this obviously solve a massive issue for you. And potentially, this can even help you to remove the need of actually playing liberal onto your team as well. Because let's say if you actually have a very quick spike focused team, you have 4 characters with quick spiking skill, then you also have, let's say, SP Kenma, who also have a receiving skill, then you already have 5 out of the 6 members on your team capable of receiving, so you don't even need a liberal anymore as well. So this just basically offers a lot more flexibility when it comes to team building, and basically really improve the value of just like quick spiking teams in general as well. Okay, so that's kind of what this is, just like an insane buff, like absolutely insane in terms of how easy it is to trigger, the value is able to provide in terms of the 150% increase in receive stat, and also this new mechanical team building flexibility that you can now also do with quick specialty teams. Absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. Then lastly, we have the memory. Now this one's quite straightforward. It increases the quick spiking stat by 12%. And then when you do a perfect set, then you get additional 10% attack technique. When you do a perfect receive, that's additional 6%. So in total, you can get 16% if it's both a perfect receive and also a perfect set. And like I said, when you actually have SP Kenma, you can potentially actually force that to happen with SP Kenma's memory. So this is actually quite nice. And even without that, to be honest, like perfect set and receive, even though you can't really control that, they still do tend to happen quite a lot in the match. And the buff here is actually attack technique, which is also one of those stats, which is really hard to get a buff in as well. So overall, I do feel like this memory is quite decent for any kind of characters who actually have a quick spiking ultimate, or any mid blocker with a quick spiking ultimate. Okay. But yeah, so overall, that's basically all the detail for SP Liev in terms of his skills, his resonance, his deployment bond, and also his memory. My overall first impression, obviously this is without any testing, so take this with a pinch of salt, but my overall first reaction is that a lot of the description in his skills are definitely overstated if you actually think about the story. For example, there's a huge amount of inconsistency regarding the scoring ace buff in terms of whether or not how much value you can actually get out of it, and then some of the numbers it's been stated in his kit is just simply unfeasible as well. So for me, SPDF is a character because of this inconsistency with scoring ace buff. He basically can perform ridiculously high ceiling if everything goes in the perfect way, perfect combination, or he could also end up hardly doing any buff because, for example, scoring ace is on a setter, and therefore you won't actually get increased much in terms of the actual stats that Leaf would use. His block is kind of being overshadowed by the fact that you already have another teammate with a blocking skill as well. And then this also requires RNG for you to actually line it up such that your receive and set happen to be perfect just on the right turn when your Leaf is the one needing to do the spike as well. Okay, so there's a huge amount of RNG involved, but yeah, definitely Leaf have very, very high ceiling if everything goes his way. But other than that, he could also be just a very, very average player if they don't actually happen to line up perfectly. Now, what makes Leaf absolutely insanely strong, in my opinion, however, is this deploying ball with SP Kema. So for me, I'm definitely going to think of a bundled deal in the sense that if you're going to play SP Kema, you need to have SP Leaf, okay? I think that's probably the best selling point from Leaf. And if you need to decide, for example, your future summons on whether or not to save some resources for Leaf, you can just boil that decision down to whether or not you plan to summon the second version of SP Kemba.